The competitive 40K network presents Art of War. Art of War. Strategy and tactics. Discussions with the best players on the planet. Now your host, Nick Nanavati.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Art of War 40K podcast. This week, we are joined by a rather special guest, Brian Jones, one of our Art of War coaches, off his very first Super Major win with none other than Imperial Knights. I truly did not believe that could be done, and here Brian is to prove us all wrong. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm great, Nick. I am, a little disbelief myself, I think, coming into the end of the weekend. But, yeah, I'm great.
Dude, that's awesome.
Really fun tournament.
You should be doing great. I mean, Imperial Knights winning a 300-plus person Super Major is absolutely incredible. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about, folks. Part one of this two-part episode is going to be getting to know Brian, his Imperial Knight army list, how it operates on the table, kind of how he makes choices with so few models and all that stuff. And then in part two, for our continued conversation, that's going to be for our patrons. Brian and I are going to break down his games, all 8 of them, and how he approached them, how he handled them, and basically, how do you go 8-0 in a Super Major very, very technically. So if you're interested in Knights, if you're interested in Warhammer, if you're interested in learning the game and becoming your best, I implore you to sign up for this Patreon. Not only do you get access to this part 2, but you get access to 275 plus other part 2s and access to our amazing Discord server where you can access players like Brian who will just answer your questions along with other top players in the game. And now we're even running TTS leagues for our members so you can just play more Warhammer for free. It is a no-brainer to sign up, folks. We'll catch you there. Brian, are you excited?
I'm very excited, Nick. What a great way to start the day.
This is a great way to start today. Hell yeah. Talk to me about this tournament. I know you always go to Cherokee. This is like your 3rd or 4th time going. What's your relationship with this event?
Yeah, I've been to Cherokee every time since the first one. My best friend from high school and the person responsible for getting me into 40K, David Otten, lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. So it's a chance for us to play at a tournament together. So every year I fly up and we make up the drive. Cherokee it's been really cool to see the growth of the event. And, there was the snowstorm the few days before the event this year. And I was like, oh, there's no way they'll wind up with the 300. And they only had, I think, 3 drops from the storm, which is just absolutely incredible as far as the community and how important that tournament is in that region. It's really cool.
Especially when you consider like Cherokee is kind of like in the mountains, like not super easy to access. That's really awesome to get 300 players out there.
Yeah, because there's no direct airport in Cherokee. You're flying into Asheville or Knoxville like I did. And we drove up along, it's called the Dragon's Tail. So it's this super curvy road through the mountains and like it had just snowed. So it was super beautiful. This was probably my favorite trip up there yet. I won't lie.
Wow. I mean, is that because you won or is that for all the other reasons?
Both?
Both.
That's an okay answer, right?
That's definitely okay, Brian. That's totally valid. So you've been playing Knights forever. You're like the Knight guy. And you've had like middling success with them because a lot of people perceive them as like a middling faction, right? And that's definitely not what one would consider a top tier faction. And I know recently you just took them to the Las Vegas Open. You did pretty well there. You took them to a GT beforehand, but none of it was like winning the event type of results. What was the difference in your mind from all of these various tournaments that you've attended with Knights to this one?
So I'll say 2 things. One, and it even showed at LVO, I felt like all of the Grotmus detachments have I've hit it in some other State of the Factions and stuff, have really opened up the meta. I don't feel like there's any one archetype list you can prepare for. And I've always felt that that's an area that Knights excel. You and I have talked about them in a team setting. I think you can build a good take-all-comers list out of Imperial Knights that can kind of go in and keep a game close. And I also feel like, and with some of the allies we've had and just some of the tweaks to the data sheets and points costs, this list that I took, I felt like really had an answer for just about everything as far as what I might face. And it was a interesting mission run and layout run. I don't know for anybody who's taken a look at the mission pack. It was not the LVO run for sure. The layouts were a little bit different. We're looking at layouts 1, 2, and 3 for the most part. And just it made for a very interesting competition. And I don't think I'm going to look again, but I don't think I played the same army twice in 8 rounds.
Wow, that's a healthy meta if I ever saw one.
No, I did not. I played 8 completely different armies.
That's amazing. That's really cool. So, Brian, it sounds like it was right place, right time with respect to the way the meta shifted. Because you're speaking truth there. The meta is super diverse and wide. You can look at any tournament in the world and you'll see a diverse top end of that spectrum, and different events have different winners. It is not like the days where Eldari rules everything, or one army is on top and the rest of you can go play for second. The meta is so wide that Knights are winning super majors, which is amazing.
And I
One
should
of the
point out, the second place finisher was also Imperial Knights with a completely different list from me.
I
He
know,
went
I know.
7-0-1.
That's crazy. I was thinking about getting that person who also went undefeated with Knights, which is incredible. But 2 night episodes back to back, I don't know.
There are dozens of us out there. There are dozens of us, Nick.
I didn't realize there were so many talented Knight players. This is amazing. It's a great time to be a Knight. So when you're playing Knights, Brian, this is more like a strategy playstyle thing. You have very few models by design, and they are somewhat vulnerable to wild dice swings, right? Like on one activation, Canis could just pass all his saves. On another, he could just fail all his saves and he just dies. How do you account for such wild variance? As top players, we're always trying to mitigate the impact of dice and try to make safe plays that are not likely to go a falter, but at some point you just have to roll the dice with Knights and live with the results. What is your take on that?
So this is something you and I have talked about a lot, kind of offline, Nick, trying to help me get a little bit better, because its variance is huge with Knights. When you're talking about a 4-up invuln against a lot of D6 plus 2 weapons, like it could be no damage, it could be 8 damage. It's so bad. And so it's really thinking about your game plan. And I always take like 2 to 3 minutes before my round starts, before I even move to the table. I look at my opponent's list with the mission in mind, and I think about, okay, what is the best play for me to be able to keep it close and create opportunities for me to create a win? And that is how I have to approach every game. There's no, and when we jump into my individual games later, my round 4 in particular, it's really an interesting dichotomy in that matchup and how both players approached it, of trying to mitigate risk. But sometimes, and this was, I'm really glad I remembered it, was this tournament. I remembered that sometimes as an Imperial Knights player, you do just have to deploy on the line and say, I'm T12. I'm going to hope that my variance is slightly better than yours. And it did pay off. There is inevitably those moments, but one of the things in particular that I've liked in this edition is that Imperial Agents as an allied force has opened up the ability to mitigate some of that variance by allowing us to kind of spread our points costs a little bit more. And it's made it, I really enjoyed this list. I did not feel nearly as swingy as I had in kind of past tournaments, DreamHack last year and things like that, as we were taking Knights in a team setting, where I would come back to you and be like, I failed the wrong like 3 or 4 up saves and the game just swung.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially in teams, it can be very dangerous, right? Like you put a Knight player into a situation where it should be okay, and then all of a sudden, as you said, you fail some extra saves, and the whole team suffers for that. In a singles event, it can end your run before prematurely. Just like I failed too many saves, and things got away from me. And it doesn't even have to be save oriented, right? Like something like Canis or whatever tries to make a 5-inch charge and he fails it. Everybody's vulnerable to that. But with having 400 something points tied up in a single unit that you're counting on doing, shoot one thing, charge another thing, that's 50% of like a huge amount of your army's output. There's just so much the risk mitigation there.
You have to be able to laugh at those moments. If you want to play Imperial Knights and you're going to go into it with a competitive mindset, you've got to remember to be able to laugh at when it goes wrong. There's one of my stream games where it's like the second turn and I put Canis out there, my 450 point model. I rolled a 1 on his D6 gun, and he hits on 2s, and I managed to roll back-to-back 1s for the 1 hit. And I was like, that's my 450 points model shooting phase, everybody. This is what I'm here for.
That's it.
You've just got to be able to know that those moments are going to happen. And I had 8 great opponents who, we could laugh at that moment. And the next turn, when you roll a 6 for the number of shots, your opponent and you being just as like happy to roll with the punches makes the game even more enjoyable.
I love that. I think I've heard from a lot of people, and it's one of the main reasons you're on Team Run, is like your attitude and sportsmanship throughout the game is just like impeccable. And, I've heard nothing but great things. And I think that shines through, because a lot of players would get upset. They feel like their tournament is ending because Canis rolled a 1 into 2 more 1s. And it's like, why are the dice gods against me? You embrace that element of it and you kind of take it in stride and, understanding that it ebbs and flows and next turn you're going to roll 6 into 6. So how do you, I guess, is that just a mindset thing? Is that like a personality thing? How do you have such a great relationship with the variance?
So I think it's both a little bit. I think you've got to be able to go in and know like self-deprecating humor is my coping mechanism, man. Like that's how I am. So I have that ability to laugh at myself. It's a way that I handle things, and then being able to go in and every game I start off, I want to have a great game with an opponent. I look at every game as a chance to make a new friend in life, and I think about my round 6 was against Colin. First time he and I have gotten to play, and we had a turn in, I think it's turn 3. He shot his entire creations of bio. I mean, 2 predators, a lot, and didn't do a single wound. Like I don't know where my dice came from. I made any failed save I failed. I made the 6-up feel no pain. I wasn't even on a 5-up. I was just making 6-up feel no pains left, right, and center. And we'd had such a good game and good camaraderie that if you go and I think it's on War Games Live, you can see both of us just laughing and having a good time. And that's a moment that in competitive 40K, right? It's really easy to think about that and be like, oh, that's a moment where a game falls apart. 2 people are just going to be you're apologizing to your opponent and you feel bad. Your opponent's really upset. And instead for us, it just made the game more epic. And I think that part is a mindset. And it's one it's that social contract you've got to form with your opponent. And I think it's really important. And so if you're going to play any kind of high variance army, I would tell you, if you are somebody who feels like I get really frustrated easily, maybe don't take them to a tournament with the mindset to win, because I think you'll find both the games don't go the way you want, and you'll find that you're frustrated with how the games have gone, and that might frustrate your opponent too.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think that mindset can really completely shift the vibe of the weekend. And as you said, you had such an amazing weekend. I think a lot of players not only do themselves a disservice by robbing themselves of the fun and experience of it all, because sometimes you do roll 1s, but they also probably give up in those moments a little more than they need to, get dejected, get down in the situation, kind of feel like they've lost before it's official. And then where you might look for an out and squeak a win, a lot of players just kind of crumble in that moment. I think that is also something that separates a top player from someone aspiring to be a top player.
Yeah, and that is one thing that I think Knights have taught me well is, they're big single point model, right? And I've got to squeeze every drop of blood from that stone that I can. And so for anybody who's looking to just learn to maximize activations, you're learning to be able to, all right, I feel like I've got a good grasp on strategy, but I want to improve my turn to turn play and be able to know how I should order things and what I do there. I do think Knights are a great training army in that sense, because you really have to maximize each activation. You've got to know every tool in your toolbox. And I won't lie, when it's only 6 data sheets, it gets kind of easy.
Yeah, right. Especially with a gajillion reps, you put it on the one faction. And to that point, Brian, you've really been a very dedicated Knight player, only kind of stringing into Votann here and there for teams, but 90% of your games seem to be with Knights. Do you think that level of faction expertise is a key thing for your success?
I do. I think, and it's something I've told anybody I've worked with coaching, is that especially if you're looking to up level your game, you're saying, I want to go from going 3-3 to 4-2 or a 5-1 in a GT, or hell, I'd love, everyone would love to go 6-0. But that, I think you pick an army and a playstyle that you like and commit to the reps. While I mean, Nick, I'm kind of constantly jealous of you and Jack and your ability to just drop in on an army and steamroll. I struggle when I don't know my data sheets in and out, because I can't get that minimum maximum out of everything. And I think that's really in a game between you and me, right? If I'm in an army I don't know, that's a huge disadvantage for me.
Just last week, we had John Lennon on the show after he won the Warzone Atlanta tournament. And one of the key things he noted in his interview was that comfortability and experience really wins the tiebreaker between 2 very experienced quality players. So and what you're saying is very true, not only in how getting you through tough matchups in earlier rounds, but if you and I go at it, and if I'm playing an army I've never played before and you're playing Knights, you just know what to do. You played that match before and I haven't, and that's a huge advantage to you right off the bat.
And that is even more so after 7 rounds, right? Going into 8 rounds.
Yeah, because at some
That
point it's
mental
muscle memory,
load.
right?
Yeah. And that is the one thing, again, to just talk about like approaching the game. Once you've committed to a list that you like and you want to get better at, you're going to learn the data sheets and you're going to learn all of your unit stats. And what that means is that as your opponent's activating and doing things, what you're not doing is going, okay, let me look up my unit. Okay, it's this. You're talking about T10, whatever. Here's the wound rolls. And instead, what you're doing is you're looking at the plays and you're thinking ahead now. Okay, he's just done this. I'm going to start thinking about my next turn. You get out of that in the moment and you get that greater perspective on the game as a whole. I had, that was for me an eye-opening moment when Jack and I played a game, and I'm like struggling through kind of a turn and trying to think about, and Jack just like casually looks at me and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm not putting my unit on that objective because I know you haven't drawn overwhelming force yet, and you might do it next turn." And for me, it was like a moment where I was like, "Whoa, he's thinking so much farther ahead than I am. Here I am, like scrambling to look up, info on my units." And because Jack knows his list, this is when he was in his Blood Angels phase. He just is constantly looking ahead. And that's really an advantage that I can't stress enough for any developing player, is when you can switch from constantly being focused in the moment, flipping from data sheet to data sheet, to looking at the table and looking at your next turn. That is a colossal advantage.
Right. Absolutely. Just being able to think ahead in those games and really see the game as a holistic 5-turn thing, as opposed to just in the moment, this is what I'm supposed to do. I think that also is a huge separator between players. But let's talk a little bit more about your army list and how it is intended to operate. Brian, could you just walk me through the list you took to Cherokee?
Yeah, so anyone who's listened to me knows I'm normally a huge proponent of 3 big knights. I play Imperial Knights to get the big ones on the table. I shifted over to a 2-knight list in the past couple of months, taking Canis Rex, who hands down our best data sheet. Know him, love him. He is the patron saint of Imperial Knights right now. I'm also taking an Imperial Cerastus Knight Atrapos. So Forge World model. It is the only Cerastus Knight still only in resin. So plastic kit, I'm sure, is coming. And it brings a good anti-vehicle component. Its inbuilt data sheet ability is that it gets +1 to hit against vehicles and monsters. And then if it happens to be shooting against a Towering or Titanic model, it also gets +1 to wound. That's what its bondsman ability revolves around as well. Unfortunately, in my 8 rounds, I managed to not encounter a single Titanic or Towering model, but still. It brings a very solid data sheet at 25 wounds. It's a 12-inch move, which is great for Imperial Knights. And on top of that, it keeps its invuln in combat with its 5-up invuln. And it is the best combat profile of a Cerastus Knight that we have. So as far as an all-arounder to complement Canis, because everything I just said about the Atrapos is pretty true for Canis as well, but to a higher extent, except for Canis lacks that invuln in combat. So it's a great yin and yang as far as having a unit that could commit first and Canis could come in and bail him out, or vice versa. And I've found the 1-2 punch of those two to be phenomenal. Following that up, I'm bringing 3 Armiger Warglaives and only 1 Helverin. All of them have stubbers on top. It's something I swear by in Imperial Knights lists. And then I prefer the Warglaives for that ability to push up with the big knights. They've got combat. The Melta is a huge complement to whatever you might need to be doing. There's not a lot of problems that Melta 4 is not an answer to, which is really nice. And then the 1 Helverin, as we get into the allies, the emulators really help it shine in the role it's meant to be. While it's only AP1, having that anti-fly 2-up, if it's in my deployment zone or on an objective, is incredibly helpful, and it gives a volume of shots that the Warglaives don't. So it's a good backfield player for me. That shifts us into the allies component of my list. So I'm bringing Imperial agents. I've got 1 Calidus Assassin. I think it's a staple in a lot of Imperial lists, not just Imperial Knights, because for the 100 points, it's a perfect slot in as far as availability in secondary play. And if you watch any of my games or when we get into the second half, I actually found her huge for defensive abilities. I positioned her frequently in my games around my big knights, forcing my opponent to either pay extra CP or not be able to use a key ability to put down my big knights. That's a major tool that most armies need, is a stratagem to reroll wounds or +1 to wound or anything like that in combat to help damage a big knight. And anytime you can take that away is huge. On top of that, I've got 1 Subductor squad. So it's 10 T3 bodies and 1 dog. They've got a 3-up armor save, 4-up invuln. They're a wonderful home field objective holder. They can screen out. It just gives you some very stubborn bodies that aren't vulnerable to indirect and can screen out your home field. And then rounding out the list, I brought 2 Sisters Immolators that I borrowed from you. So thank you, Nick. With the Immolation Flamers, the Heavy Bolter, and a Hunter Killer Missile. And what that allows me to do is split my 1 Sisters of Battle squad into the 2 transports. So I take 1 5-girl squad that's just bolters and 1 5-girl squad that's got all of the good stuff. And that gives me some early game pieces to push out, taking midfield and forcing my opponent to commit without me having to trade an Armiger just to get my opponent to expose themselves. And I found that to be a key element of this list and how it can function in the current meta.
So you're kind of using those immolators as the early trade pieces to be a profile similar to Knights, where like it's a toughness 10 vehicle with a bunch of wounds. Your opponent has to take anti-tank resources and respond to it, and in doing so, you then get to kill those anti-tank resources by counter-shooting with all of your Knights, and then your Knights get to act with a little more impunity for the rest of the game. Is that the idea?
100%. And, it's at T10. It has the 6-up invuln, which is great. And the Immolation Flamers are also a phenomenal Overwatch threat that we normally lack as Imperial Knights, since Titanic models can't Overwatch. So they just bring a tactical viability that kind of you don't see a lot. And then inside those transports, if they pop them, you have 5 3-up armor save bodies with a 6-up invuln that are OC2 and sticky objectives. That is not nothing. It's just brought a lot of tactical ability and strategic shifts that you don't have in a pure Knights list. Trust me, I wish I could, and just bringing the big bodies, but you've got to adapt to the reality of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are listening to this, it probably means you play Warhammer 40k. And if you're playing Warhammer, you know you need a lot of dice. Baron of Dice is where we get our dice from. They produce amazing different kinds of dice. We just recently got all kinds of different faction dice shipped to us, which we use on our stream games. But not only do they look really cool, but they're highly customizable. You can get different symbols, corners that are square, corners that are round, different shapes and sizes, different sided dice. It's all the rage. And they're customizable in color and design as well. They are so cool looking. Not only that, but they feel great to roll in your hands. I've never held dice that roll and feel this good. Not only that, but they are scientifically perfectly balanced. There are tons of case studies on people rolling thousands of dice and recording all the results that they get. And sometimes you might get a die that rolls just a few too many ones. We've all had to throw it out before. These dice are not like that. They are perfectly balanced to a T, thousands of rolls, perfect distribution. If you want to take your Warhammer game seriously and make sure the dice are not screwing you over, get some Baron of Dice.
I love this little innovation of the Sisters Immolators into the Knight Army. I know a couple other Knight players have been doing that as well, and I'm excited to see it doing so well for them. It makes perfect sense to me from like a strategic standpoint. It's not just like use your Armiger to screen for your other Armiger. Like you actually have somewhat diversity in data sheets now. You have like a legitimate amount of infantry, and you have these cheaper Knight-like profiles in the form of the Immolators, and they synergize with each other with Ignores Cover and all that. So when you're playing this army, how do you determine your strategy going into the game? I know you mentioned you look at every deployment and mission like it's its own snowflake, and you have to match up your approach to each opponent. What is your process for determining should I go aggro or defensive, or which knight should lead? Since you have a lot of like very powerful, unique data sheets here.
Yeah, it is a mission by mission case because it's got and matchup by matchup. So that's why I strongly advocate for take a minute, sit down, look at your mission, your opponent's list, and figure out, okay, what is this list going to try to do into me? It's a little bit easier, I won't lie, as Imperial Knights to start to get into that analysis mode because you go, what is a threat to T12, right? What is going to try to remove my biggest pieces to assert board control? And what that lets me do is, and by looking at the mission, I go, okay, how do I feel about going first? How do I feel about going second? I went first in all 4 of my first rounds in this tournament, which is, I will assure you, not what I wanted to do. Particularly because one of those was Purge the Foe. And I managed to, Purge the Foe going second as Imperial Knights is great. And I went first. And so you really have to bank your strategy around that going, how do I make sure that there's a path forward in whatever way deployment goes, whatever way the mission goes. And that's where, again, I think the Sisters unlocked a lot for me, both in deployment and my approach to the mission, because I know I don't mind exposing the Immolators a little bit in deployment, because if you want to come out and commit your anti-tank turn 1, top of 1, to pop an Immolator that my Sisters can get behind cover from, and then I can respond by coming out and immediately taking out anti-tank pieces that I need to remove anyway. Cool. Sign me up. I'm there for it, man. And it just is allowed. They also have that 12-inch move, so it quickly lets me get out for, secure no man's land, for area denial, cleanse, anything like that, without needing to advance an Armiger, push them forward. And it's just really allowed me to think a lot more carefully about how I want to deploy my 2 big knights in my deployment zone, and how the 4 Armigers will be able to line up with them. I did find myself in half my games, I strategic reserved an Armiger, which opens up a lot of ability to create threat and pressure in addition to your Mysterious Guardian Knight that you don't normally get, because a Warglaive being able to come in off the side of the board edge in melter range of something is a real threat your opponent's got to think about. And then if you bang that 9-inch charge, like that's not nothing. So it created a lot of unique pressure in some matchups for me that was very, very valuable in leveraging every tool I could to get the win.
Yeah, your army is very up and down for a knight army, right? The Mysterious Garden allows you to pick up a knight and teleport it at the end of your opponent's turn. And then you said you're going to reserve an Armiger, and you have the Calidus who goes up and down as well. So I think a lot of players, myself included, definitely look at a knight army and think it's a relatively linear approach to the game. Like, here's my tough stats and my big guns, and they're trying to kill you and hold objectives. Fine, simple, whatever. And then you had all these complications into the game through rapid ingress potential up and down on not just turns 1, 2, or 3, but like any turn of the game, a Mysterious Garden could just happen to you. So you've got to upkeep those screens forever. When you're leveraging your approach to the game, are you like trying to hide your army for the most part and then use these reserves to create momentum to expose everything all at once? Or is it case by case there too?
Definitely case by case. I played World Leaders in my second matchup. They had a single Forge Fiend, so it's actually, I felt like that was infinitely more shooting than I normally see in a World Leaders list.
Right.
But I felt very confident being able to deploy my big knights in place to have dominant firing lanes if my opponent just decided to, all in push right away. Whereas for most of my other matchups, you're trying to find those pockets in your deployment to be able to safely place your 2 big knights so that they're not going to be, you do not want to give up a knight chassis on turn 1 for no reason, just because you deployed it. That should never be the case. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the layouts were not the normal layouts you see with a lot of these missions, which is what also led me to leaning into strategic reserves, because it was taking a look at the board and going, yeah, I can't hide everything. I've got to have something off the table, because you can't say, oh, you've got a couple, you have 10 las cannons. I'm totally going to put a knight out in the open and just dare you. That's a very, very risky maneuver. And that's how a knight player loses before they've ever moved a model.
Right. Now, is it like a rule of thumb, War Leaders, being a very unique exception to this rule, but like against a normal army that has some amount of anti-tank shooting, are you always deploying your knights like behind terrain, or is there like a threshold of risk tolerance where you're willing to take that risk and deploy yourself out there if they don't have much?
It's definitely risk tolerance. I would say there are some even like guard matchups where I'll look at it and go, okay, they have shooting, or Space Marine matchups, but if they reserve a certain number of like Vindicators or Russes or Rogaldorn, and they put them in reserves where they're committing to later in the game saving that firepower, I'll definitely evaluate it and go, I might deploy out in the open and say, I know you don't have the firepower in turn 1 to lift my threats, so I'm going to push them right into you. Every once in a while, you've got to turn off the cagey brain with Imperial Knights and just say, I win the stat check, and I need to take advantage of that, because I have lost games by being too cute and trying to play cagey when my opponents had reserved the major threats to me, and I should have just taken advantage of that.
That seems like a really fine and dangerous line to toe, right? Like sometimes you have to stat check them, but then sometimes if you stat check them, it goes terribly, so you don't want to stat check them. I know you played a million games with this Knights list. If you could try to codify your thought process into some form of not just muscle memory for yourself, like what would that look like?
I'll give a sneak peek into part 2 if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
My 4th round matchup was into Stormland Space Wolves. Thunderwolf Cav, looking 1 Vindicator and just 30 Wolf, and a lot of melee, a lot of AP2, 2 damage, which for any Knights player, like there's a certain amount of fear there because it's the perfect amount of AP, even for an Atrapos where you have an invuln because it's pushing it right to it. And as soon as you start failing saves, the damage piles up. And when my opponent and I reached the table and we got into deployment, he immediately reserved his Vindicator. And I went, all right, that's the one sole threat. While it's on search and destroy, so I know he's going to have one unit in my face if he goes first, no matter what. Only 18 inches between us. They can auto advance a mounted unit 9 inches. Like, I know I'm in trouble. And I went, okay, there's no real ranged firepower. I'm comfortable betting round 1 on combat with a single Space Wolf unit because the whole army can't get there turn 1. And so I adjusted my deployment strategy. I wound up putting my 2 big knights as aggressively kind of as I could to make sure that they would be able to get firing lanes if I got first turn. And I went, all right, I'm very comfortable betting here because I know they're going to be able to remove the necessary threats if I go first. And or if I don't, I have a strong statistical chance of not losing a big knight and being able to pick up the threat that they overcommit to come and get me. Because I have found a lot of opponents, if you give them that opportunity, where it's a gamble, like, look, I'm going to need like a 5-inch charge to then make or a 5-inch advance to make an 8-inch charge. But that means turn 1, I could potentially pick up a big knight. A lot of people are going to jump at that chance because they go, that's exactly what I need to do to get the game in my favor. And so you're stacking those odds in your favor of going, I mean, this could go wrong, but the statistical variance is in my advantage. And that's a rare thing to be able to say as a Knights player, right? And that's kind of a key shift you've got to be able to have, is knowing what is the right amount of risk to bring your opponent out into an area they don't want to be in.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And a great shout towards part 2. So you're getting a sneak peek of all that goodness. We're going to go through every single game with Brian and talk about exactly how he approached every single one. And as we learned earlier in his strategy approach, it is case by case. So you want to know how to play every single mission and matchup. And Brian did play against 8 different armies. So it'd be really exciting. Now, Brian, I have a few more questions in terms of your strategy level here. How are you handling secondaries? Like, Knights are notoriously not good at secondaries, and you've allied in some stuff to try to help with that. But what is your approach to secondaries?
I love tactical. I love that in this edition. I will not lie. It gives us access to CP, which we will want, and we actually have a frightening amount of options for doing secondaries. Having 4 Armigers that are all move 12, 2 Immolators that are move 12, a Calidus Assassin that can uppy downy, and an Atrapos that can move 12. And a lot of people have forgotten that in this most recent mission pack, Titanic characters gained the ability to action and still shoot. So both Canis Rex and my Atrapos can shoot and still cleanse on an objective, or do containment for me. And that opens up a lot. You find that you actually have more options than you're kind of used to. And one of the things I've gotten a little bit addicted to with Knights is that large movement. It means that you can deploy safely, but still, if you draw that turn 1 containment, right, and you've got to get out of your deployment zone, wholly within 9 inches of the board edge to get those sweet 6 points, we have the models to do that. And so I found there's certain ones that don't normally fit well. Behind enemy lines early is just not good for the Imperial Knights army. You don't want to overcommit early. That's going to be a redraw for me. But the other component into secondaries that I found I've had to embrace is not being afraid of using new orders, especially if I'm getting any kind of an early game advantage. This was key in my round 5, is that I need to maximize good secondary draws when I can get them, or good secondary situations to try to get good draws. And so I leverage new orders a lot, especially in turn 1, where you can quickly burn through a lot of bad cards because so many of them now have that redraw in turn 1 option, be it Storm Hostile, behind enemy lines, things like that, where you can quickly get to at least get bad cards out of the way or get to a card you really want to have. And so, extend, secure, area denial, these aren't terrible things when you've got, especially the sisters, opening up that ability to go, cool, here's an Immolator in the middle. It's going to get me area denial and, half of my cleanse on turn 1. Are you going to come forward and try to deal with the T10, or are you just going to give me primary in turn 2? The list has really created a lot of interesting challenges for my opponent in the secondary game, I found, and it's removed a lot of the initial challenges I found in the edition that we faced in secondary action economy.
Right. I definitely see all these allies and view them as not just tools to screen or tools to potentially get the game going, like an minute later on the objective is not a knight on the objective, but also great secondary tools, right? Like containment, I imagine, like a turn like cleanse containment would probably be very hard normally for you to do 4 different actions in 4 different spots of the board. But I could really see your list actually just doing that now and not really struggling unless it's a really goad violence turn.
Exactly, and that was a huge, like, candidly for me in my list, was a huge weakness earlier in this edition, and even in this Pariah Nexus. Just finding the right balance of having available actions while still being able to, when I need to have a go turn. There's nothing worse for a unit limited army that on their go turn draws cleanse containment, and you're like, well, I don't have 4 units to give up and do nothing.
Yeah. Now, what about command point management? I know rotate ion shields is definitely a very useful stratagem, but what else are you spending CP on, budgeting CP for?
Oddly enough, it's pretty heavily in the core stratagems versus my detachment stratagems. Rotate is a big one. That there are certain matchups that you just live and die by it. But Canis having that discounted stratagem in each player turn is hugely helpful for our CP economy, because you just kind of know in your head, okay, whatever I might need to use for Canis is baked in, and I can think about just how I'll need to leverage it for the rest of my army. So the first thing I'm doing is I go into a new round is I'm thinking about, if my opponent's going first, okay, what do I want to save if he's going to commit everything to it? If he shoots at this Armiger first, am I willing to spin the rotate, or do I know he's lining up for something else? That's a good consideration of where I want to spend my defensive CP. But then offensively, each turn I'm thinking about, okay, am I going to need a CP reroll in my shooting phase for a number of shots on either Canis or the Atrapos? I won't lie, one of the Achilles heels of this list, and something I don't love, is that on my big knights, every major weapon is a variable shot. That's a weakness, right? And it's unfortunately just a required risk right now in the list build, but it is something I'm always thinking about. If I don't have to use that CP for reroll a number of shots, then I know, okay, I've got it lined up if I need a charge. If I'm not going to be charging in this round, I know I could use it on a damage roll on, say, my singularity cannon, or on a melt from an Armiger. And then finally, a major spend for us is tank shock. That's a really, really key point to leverage, because it's a great tool for inflicting mortals through invulns on models that normally, if they spike the dice the right way in a combat with a knight and we have a few attacks, you're in trouble. And the other core stratagem again, that I found using frequently in this tournament was heroic intervention. Setting up either my big knights to be able to heroic in to save my little knights or smaller squads, and forcing my opponent to really think through that charge decision. Or I actually heroic my Calidus 4 separate times in this tournament, because she's got fights first, AP 4, 2 damage. She can remove melee heavy hitters when you're getting charged by, possessed. I used her against possessed. I used her against exalted 8-bound. I used her against terminators. I used her against world leaders terminators as well, all to just suddenly remove a number of attacks that really swung the balance in my favor, and then force my opponent to decide, do I divert a model to try to swing at her? Because usually you can heroic and control how many models can swing it at your new model. Or do I still try to kill the unit that was my goal? And it just creates a lot of interesting decision points for your opponent. So that's really where I've landed stratagem-wise. I used Squire's Duty a couple of times. I used Dev Wounds in combat a couple of times. But really leaning into the core stratagems a surprising amount more than I did my detachment ones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And did you find you were struggling for CP economy, or was it really not a challenge?
There were definitely matches where I would have loved to completed my vow a little earlier and gotten those free 3 CP, because I found once you get that and suddenly you're looking, you enter a round with 4 or 5 CP instead of that normal 1 or 2, it really opens the doors for you to leverage all aspects of the toolbox. But early on, especially if I am doing the redraw of objectives, I'm finding myself hurting a little bit for CP economy. I wouldn't mind knights having access to somebody to help generate that, that another CP point. Against Eldar and some other armies, I could definitely, Ultramarines who are just constantly having 3 CP. That definitely I felt that discrepancy.
Awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes it's not an issue. Sometimes definitely can feel painful. I get that. So, Brian, before we head off to part 2 and really get deep dived into your games, I have one more question for you.
Sure.
if you had a piece of advice for an aspiring Warhammer 40K player, someone to look to get better at the game and win super majors one day, what would that piece of advice be?
I think what I hit on earlier, which is commit to playing a list for a while, allowing yourself to get better at the game. Those skills will transfer to new lists, but in order to get better at the game, you've got to create the space for yourself to see the table as a whole and not be constantly looking at data sheets. And going hand in hand with that, give yourself the opportunity to think before every game. We all get really excited when pairings go up. You want to rush into it and just get going. And then all of a sudden you're in round one and you're like, I'm not even sure what I was deploying for. Give yourself those 2 or 3 minutes to just look at your opponent's list and the mission and come up with a rough game plan. You will be amazed how much of a difference that makes in your level of comfort and your level of ability to think ahead in each turn when you're going, yeah, this is the strategy I thought of, not, oh my gosh, what should my strategy be halfway through turn 2? I think those are the biggest 2 stepping stones to just getting yourself in a much more comfortable place where even with a chess clock and worrying about it, you're not focused on time because you've created that familiarity with the world to function.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think that's great advice, and I think it's been a fantastic time having you. Congratulations again on your first place victory at the Cherokee Super Major. That is excellent, and congratulations.
Thank you so much. It was awesome, and yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. This has been a ton of fun.
You're very welcome. All right, folks. You want to continue this conversation with Brian, you want to get into his games, you want to get into the mindset of Super Major winners, come on and join us in Patreon. It's patreon.com/AOW40K. $5 a month gets you access to this episode, 275 plus other episodes with amazing Warhammer players. Our Discord server where you can talk to players like John, like Brian, all kinds of great players. And TTS leagues are now a thing too in our Discord. So you just cannot say no to the value. The value is insane. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you next time.
Like what you just listened to? Check out Art of War Down Under and Art of War Unbroken on the competitive 40K network. theartofwar40k.com.